you and I have talked about for a while, and the inspiration behind this idea is so many people are wondering, well, what do I do next in retirement? What does that look like? It's such a big word. And, they talk about planning and how much to save and what that life looks like and what to do with the financial side of it. Then there's the very personal side of it. And I hear a lot about people just trying to find that meaning because they have that meaning and have something to work for. And when that ends, it becomes okay, well, I was building, accumulating, I was doing what I needed to do to support my family or whoever. Now it's like, well, now what? When you don't have like an athlete, you don't have the crowd anymore. You're not performing in front of a crowd. You don't have that adrenaline or responsibility. And then there's this new period of life that could be 30 or more years. So that's something we want to talk about is what does that look like and how to have meaning and how to feel good and how to have that purpose is something we're outlining here.
Yeah, Dave, I think that's just really such a good point. And when we've talked about this, we've suggested that yeah, you build this plan in terms of financial security, but then the real question is what's next. And you brought up athletes, and I think that's a really good one because while you and I are on the precipice of doing this retirement thing, the good news for us is we don't have to worry about as much time as an athlete might have to worry about when they retire at 35. And just as an example, I like to look, and no criticism on either one, but if you take two NBA superstars, Michael Jordan and Shaquille O'Neal, it's really interesting. And Michael Jordan, who I would easily argue as a basketball fan is probably one of the greatest of all time, Michael Jordan was just an amazing competitor, incredible competitor. And if you look into his history, you can see how he continued to compete after retirement. Shaquille O'Neal also was a great competitor, but what Shaquille O'Neal did differently was Shaquille O'Neal had a very deliberate plan what he was going to do. I believe he ended up getting a PhD. And if you look at very many commercials on TV, he's on so many of those commercials because he had a vision of what he wanted to do. In his case, probably for the next 50 plus years. And I think that's what we're really trying to talk about is you can roll into this with amazing financial security, which both of them had, but without a plan you might not feel as fulfilled. And I'm not suggesting that Michael Jordan is fulfilled. I'm just using that example as diversity, that both Michael Jordan and Shaquille O'Neal, he got into a lot of different things. So I guess that really begs the question, maybe to start off with, if we're going to have purpose, what is purpose? How would you define purpose? I mean, what is that thing we're supposed to have at the end of this retirement?
That's a great question because this is something I came across, just a little backstory. I've been an advisor for over 20 years, financial advisor, and I meet with a lot of vendors. They have what are called wholesalers. They represent different companies, different insurance companies, mutual funds, all kinds of different products. So they want to talk to advisors. So advisors offer their product to their clients. And this particular wholesaler stuck out to me because he came across with a completely different concept, purpose planning for retirement, because so many things, the graphs, the charts, save this much, compound interest. This is how much you'll probably have to spend on healthcare and retirement. That's what we're used to seeing in this world. He was the only one that talked about building a plan around purpose. So it wasn't numbers, it wasn't analytics, it was very personal and emotional. It was built on these constructs of, okay, how do I spend my time? How do I have some structure? Now, one of the beauty things of retirement is, well, you don't have to have that rigid structure. If you want to sleep a little more or do other things and have that flexibility at the same time, though, is, well, how am I going to feel good about how I use my time?
Great point.
What am I going to do? And what gives me meaning now? What's important to me emotionally? There's always spending time with the kids and if you have grandkids and things like that. But it really dove deep into these pillars of emotional, mental health, the physical part of it too. What do you have to do to keep your mind and body active? Because When you're in the working world, you're constantly learning. You're constantly meeting deadlines. There's that stimulation. There's that satisfaction that people are relying on you, that you're making a difference for people. And then it becomes very quiet when you're not in that arena anymore. So I found those pillars to be very interesting, built around the mental, the health and wellness side, the giving meaning side, whether that's, serving in your community and just offering your skills, possibly mentoring. So I thought that was fascinating. And it just got me thinking because I have heard this a lot as well, what is purpose? And at first it intimidated me because I thought, oh, okay, I need to create a water aqueduct system to give people water in Africa. That's going to give me purpose. I always thought it was this huge, I've got to do something that has these huge ripple effects. And as I'm learning more about it, it could be as simple as volunteering. It could be doing what you love and sharing it with other people. So I think that's a great point, Ray, is what is that? That's going to look different for so many people. But it's so critical to give you that confidence and that mental peace of making such a big transition.
Yeah, really great points, Dave. And I think what you said that resonated with me is meaning. I think it's a hard question. It seems like an easy question. Where do you find meaning? But I think it's one you really need to think about because um, where where is it in our lives that we are most at peace? Where is it in our lives that we feel the most joy? And and you mentioned several of those things. Maybe we feel a lot of joy when we're serving somebody else, when we're volunteering, when we're doing that, or maybe we find joy as an adjunct professor at some
Hmm.
community college. I mean, I don't know what that is, but I think that is something everybody's got to think about is where do you find that? And I think maybe some of the questions now are to ourselves as we're either in retirement or thinking about retirement is what expertise do I have? What have I developed over these years? Not that and the expertise that I really enjoy doing. Um, what experiences have I had? I think a lot of times we forget that I think you reach this retirement phase and you've crossed the finish line and now it's accolades and it's just going to be a great time, but it's not because once you peak and reach the top, the only place to go is downhill, and so you don't want to go downhill. You want to continue to go uphill. So where can we go to continue to grow? And I think that's really important. And I think part of growing means kind of putting yourself out there, possibly to make some mistakes. Where can I go that I'm curious about, but somewhat uncomfortable about going there? But the curiosity is what takes me there. Sometimes I think purpose can be related to curiosity. You know, if I'm curious about something, maybe I need to explore that. And I guess the last comment I'd make on that before maybe we transition to another thought is that curiosity should be found firsthand. I think that it's so easy to ask Google and say, hey, tell me what I need to know. But I think that's a place of loneliness, and I think there's a better place to go, and that is to get out in your communities and find out where the voids are. Where's the void in my community that I'm curious about, that maybe my expertise and experience could help fill that void. Maybe that void is volunteering, or maybe that void is in a part-time job. I don't know, but I think these are some really, really good questions to consider. Um, Speaking of that, let me throw this at you. So why would finding our purpose be important? I mean, is that something that is really important to our health and welfare? I mean, is it important to retirement? Why is finding our purpose important?
I think so. I think that's a great question. I've heard this talked about a lot before is just the struggle with loneliness, is being more isolated. Possibly when you retire, you lose to some degree that connection with coworkers or people that you're partnering with, depending on what your situation is. So I think just there is possibly some stress around, well, what do I do now? I mattered. I felt like I mattered before. Now I just don't know what's out there for me. And it can seem pretty intimidating. And I think that's a big part of it is staying mentally sharp. And I know you've heard these stories too, where people will retire, they think it's great, they get some extra sleep, they play some golf, they hang out, and then months later they're like, oh, I'm bored. I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to doing what I was doing. Which, if it's because you love it and you really want to do it, that's great. If it's to avoid boredom, though, I think that's unfortunate. So trying to figure out ways to avoid that situation, but just keeping, I think that is part of the mental and physical health of having a vibrant retirement, and feeling good in retirement is keeping your mind sharp through connections with other people, whether that's getting involved or sharing similar interests, and also the physical side of it, moving, getting the right exercise, treating yourself well, feeding yourself well, because you just want to be at your best and enjoy it as much as possible. Be there for your kids, be there for your grandkids. So these things are so important for state of mind. And the more active, the more you're enjoying it, I think the more you're going to get out of it. You're going to avoid some of these health pitfalls that I think a lot of people face as they go through retirement. And I know you were talking to me before about just some of the things you heard from people about, well, they had these high powered jobs and they would call their kids and say, well, I just am so lonely now. I just don't know what to do. I remember you talking about that story. So you've heard some of this too, personally.
Yeah, there really are. In fact, there's studies too that they've done, multiple studies where they've taken control groups and they've really looked at those that are actively engaged, those that have constant routines and their lifespan, and those that don't. And it's absolutely significant. We all too often hear about somebody retiring and then in the next decade or less, their health deters and things just go downhill. But the story you were talking about, which is a really good one, was a colleague of mine was sharing a story that she was one of 12 children, and her dad was an air traffic controller and had done that for I think like 36 years, but he had a mandatory retirement at 56. And again, that's not as early as the athletes we talked about before, but it's could be earlier than we choose. And so his, in a sense, he was excited about that. They celebrated all the years that he had been there, but um, she shared with me that when he retired, his visions were what you described, Dave. He was going to play golf, he was going to read books, he was going to do stuff around the house, and all of those things. And I heard a funny story the other day that goes with that. Somebody said you have to be careful with your spouse because they view your retirement when you retire as twice as much of you and half as much money. And so
Oh,
that's not a good
yeah.
place to be. I mean, and I say that tongue in cheek, but it brings up the point, and I'll come back to the story. It brings up the point that it's a significant adjustment because now you're just together more and more, and that has to be planned out too because we all need our space, and absence does make the heart grow fonder, and we kind of have to figure out what that looks like in retirement to allow our spouses to have the space they need and also for us. And so what ended up happening was this gentleman's wife suggested he should build a pool in the back. That would be a good project. And so he thought about that. He did the calculations based on his retirement money. And then he got curious. He goes, "Gosh, I don't know how we're gonna pay for this." And it's ironic because where he went back to was his comfort zone. And he ended up finding an air traffic control job in Bahrain because he's no longer limited by age there, and it's a contract position. And so it was a 6 month gig that he could go there and make some money, get back to what he was comfortable doing. And I think that's an important thing we need to talk about is comfort, but back to what he was comfortable doing. And that's when my colleague got a phone call from her dad. And again, she was one of 12, and she did not have a very close relationship with him. And when he called, he was very vulnerable and lending his heart to his daughter, saying, "I just don't know who I am. I don't know what my purpose is. And I just feel like I've missed so much in my life as I worked with you and with your brothers and sisters and just in general." And I bring this up because retirement is a reflective period of time, and there's goodness in that. But pre-retirement should also be reflective in deciding what to do and how to do that, how to fill those voids, whether that's in the community or in your family, or somewhere else. And so he ended up finishing that job, came back, and very positively found his place, found out who he was, and some of those things. But I think this story is a good illustration of the norm. I don't know all the statistics. It'd be worth digging into it. I think we will on further podcasts. But the statistics, I would suspect, having done a little bit of research on those, as I would suspect, and push back, Dave, if you think otherwise, because you've got some experience with this too. But I would suspect that only 30%, maybe I'm being generous, 30% have truly planned, not financially, but personally, what they're going to do in their retirement. And if that's true, that means that 70% have not. And that is what's so exciting about what we're talking about, what this podcast is going to be all about. It's going to be about having those plans, going into retirement or being in retirement and now coming up with something that brings you joy and fills some of those voids. But I brought something up, so let me ask you first. So we talk about retiring comfortably. What an interesting thing to say. And financially, they talk about that. We want to make sure that you retire comfortably. Well, let's not talk finances. Let's talk about what that should mean from a planning perspective personally. Should we retire comfortably?
Well, I think from the personal side, as you brought up, the importance of the planning, more the analytical numbers side, looking at hypotheticals, gives you the same benefits that the personal side, if you're thinking ahead, if you're spending that reflective time thinking ahead as you get closer to that period of time, well, what do I want my life to look like? What gives me meaning? What do I want to spend my time doing? Visualizing, this is something I've heard a lot about, is trying to visualize what you want down the road. What does that look like? What are you doing? And try to really elicit the senses in there. I know some people say, well, this is woo-woo stuff, but I think it can be pretty powerful because it sets that in motion and you manifest it. So I think just like the planning side, when you come to an advisor and say, okay, it's 10, 15, whatever years away, how much should I keep saving? I think you take those same principles and you can apply them on the personal side. What do I want to do? Like, how do I envision my life looking like? And what will give me joy and meaning? What will help me feel like I'm contributing, making my kids, my family's life better? What's going to give me vitality and health to be around longer so I can be around for them longer? So I think it's taking those principles of planning, of having those goals lined out and how much you need to save for each one. Maybe it's looking at that side or what are the personal things and not necessarily analytical around numbers, but more the what do I want this to look like? Like, how do I want to spend my days? What would my ideal day look like? What would I be doing? Where would I be living? What's going to give me meaning, allow me to contribute to society, to my family. So I think just like the regular planning does, it's all about how do you get out in front of it, and it's going to help give you more confidence, more clarity, lessen some of that worry and anxiety. So when that time comes, you feel like you can move into that transition without just getting like a bucket of cold water dumped on your head, like, oh, it's here. Now what do I do? So I think preparing that way can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I do agree. I will push back a little bit because I think that financially, you talked about the analytics. Um, I would argue that even on the personal side, we should, and you might have said this, so maybe I should give you credit, but you said goals. And I think goals are really important. I almost think, we all, maybe of us, or maybe many of us have seen the movie Bucket List, but we all should have a bucket list. And I know some of those can be lofty, but I think we have to have some near-term goals and some long-term goals. I think the
Mm-hmm.
other thing we should do that's really important is that we should realize that, and I've talked about this before, and it's not our original thought. I heard it from someone else, but the retirement years are described as the go, slow go, and no go years. And I think in that context, we should just say, as we look at those goals, we need to realize that if we're fortunate enough to be mentally and physically healthy, we will eventually reach a point where we're not able to do as much as we want, which should be uncomfortable. And that's kind of what we were talking about. I like the phrase, we should live just on the other side of comfortable, this side of comfortable, not the comfortable side. And so to do that, we have to say, okay, if I'm fortunate enough to live to be 90 and I'm retiring at 50, well, let's call it 60, make it 30 years so it's a little bit easier. So let's say, those first 10 years, I really need to have some pretty good goals of things that I really want to stretch myself and do. And then the next few years, maybe the goals aren't quite as aggressive, and at least something to consider there. Because I think what happens with planners, I know what happens with me, is you plan, but just before execution, you do get anxiety and you get nervous because you go, oh, now I got to execute this plan. I sure hope this thing works. So I think a little anxiety is really good. But I like what you said. I think we need to define the days. We need to define. I would argue, I've done this my entire life. I would argue we should grab a 3x5 card. Most people that are retiring know what a 3x5 card is. Most of their grandchildren have no idea what that is. But grab a 3x5 card and put down our 5-year goals. We should have 5-year goals, things I want to accomplish. So if I'm 60, here's what I'd like to have done by 65. If I'm 65, here's what I'd like to have done by 70, et cetera. Because I think we should list some of those things when we're finding that purpose that help us to grow, that challenge us, that keep us just on this side of comfortable. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's really important because as time goes on, we know the brain it gets a little harder. It gets a little harder to do what we did 10, 20 years ago and have that cognitive ability. So just continuing to challenge, and I absolutely continuing to stretch yourself, learning some new skills, being not being afraid to go out and try things. And I think that just keeps you younger mentally and physically. So I do think that's really important of, how do I step out of that comfort zone and get around? I think the key there too is getting around the right people for you. It's going to be different for everybody, but the connection part of it's so important because I keep hearing about the loneliness challenge that people are just too isolated and they're facing that when you have people around you that think similarly or not. They don't have to agree on everything because I think it's healthy to have some differences so you learn, but you also help each other. You're also striving. You're lifting each other up and being challenging yourself to be around people that are a few steps ahead or several steps ahead of you. I think that's really important. And you two can help keep each other on track. And I think being part of groups is so important. And that can be very challenging. If you're in a retirement community, they have things that are catered for you. They have events planned, groups planned, but maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you're still in your own neighborhood. You're just not ready to make that transition. You still live pretty independently, which is great because then you can do the things you want to do. However, trying to find those groups, I think, and that's something we can talk about more in podcasts, is how do you develop those communities? How do you develop those communities where you're both have the same values, you're thinking the same things, you're in the same phase of life, and you want to lift each other, you want to experience things together, you want to challenge each other. So I think building those little communities is critical, and finding about more about how to do that. And I think that is a way to challenge yourself. And like you said, so I know we're anything else you want to add? I know we're covering some different topics. We're going to dive deeper into these things too as we go on. We just wanted to get things started with, why we want to do this and why it's important and what people are facing. And then what else do you think, Ray, is important that we want to get out there?
Well, again, this is our tickler. This is the first one we get out to hopefully make people think, and I hope as we finish this up, people are hungry for more. And you're exactly right, Dave. We're gonna talk and perhaps with experts on physical health and mental health, and wellness associated with that. We'll talk about much more about developing our plans, what those plans should look like. I think another one that's really interesting that would be fun, Dave, is to maybe talk about who we are. Now, it wouldn't necessarily be, our backgrounds, but that would be part of it. But who we are, how do we really define who we are? Can we define ourselves by the principles we've grown up with, perhaps the values, the things we find valuable, and then maybe who we think we are, and then decide if that's who we think we are, which would be a real interesting one to talk about. Well, then is that who I want to continue to be, or do I want to grow into
Hmm.
something different? And the only last thing I'd like to bring up, because I want to foot stop it, I think you raised such a good point, Dave. Um, it Once we know who we are and once we kind of have an idea of purpose, then we must be surrounded by like-minded people. Because no different, and we'll talk about this on another time, but no different than watching the 24-hour news cycle and feeling terrible after it. If we're around the wrong people,
Yeah.
then it's the same thing. It's just not helping us move forward. We need to be around people that challenge us, that push back on us, that encourage us, that help us to grow. And because I think the bottom line in all of this is, um, it's interesting. They call it the golden years, and they really should be golden, and they should be the best years of our life. But in order for them to be the best years of our life, we have to plan for that. And I think that's what this podcast is really going to be all about: is how
Mhm.
do we discuss, um, the concepts and the ideas to create a plan that makes the golden years the absolute best years of your life. And so I think that's where this thing's going to go. I'm pretty excited about it. I think this has been a fun first podcast, and I sure did appreciate your thoughts and look forward to more discussions.
Yeah, you too, Ray. Yeah, I really appreciate it. We're just really excited about diving into this a little more deeply. This is, our first go around here, so we're going to continue to grow ourselves and learn ourselves too. So we look forward to sharing more with you.
Absolutely.